challenge, of course, is that we've been selling raw materials and buying them back as finished products.
We have an unprincipled and unhealthy rivalry amongst African political leaders for predominance.
South Africa is in big trouble at the moment in terms of politics.
Welcome to this week's episode of The Bad Natives. With me, Charles Onyango Obo in Nairobi.
And Robert Kabushenga, the bad native in Uganda. But today I am out of Kampala. I am 290 kilometers west of Uganda in a beautiful place near one of the greatest landmarks of Uganda, the Rwenzori Mountains.
And with us this week, we are delighted to have Pan-Africanist, a guest, to join us in this conversation. He is Tembisa Fakude. Tembisa is in Johannesburg. He's got many, accolades to his name, but he is a senior research fellow at the Africa-Asia Dialogues. And he's a columnist with the Middle East Monitor in London. He's co-owner of the Mail and Guardian in South Africa. He's also a research fellow with the Al-Shaq Forum in Istanbul. Welcome, Tembisa.
Thanks for having me.
And two bad natives. One of them is on the road, and one of them is a little bit under the weather. So we'll miss them. So Tembisa, one of the reasons we've got you on is that we want to explore a subject which is close to your heart, and you are fairly informed about it. This is the Gulf, and one of the things that I want us to talk about is we are now seeing in the last couple of weeks, days, there has been a lot of reporting of what some people consider a pivot by the Gulf nations into African mining. And until now, the Gulf states had always been in infrastructure, ports, and things like that. They had invested heavily in farmland. I think in the last kind of 10 to 15 years, they have bought anything between 5 to 10 million hectares of African, farmland. So tell us, is this a correct reading that they are pivoting into this increasingly very crowded, mineral space? And if so, why do you think that is so?
Well, I think there is, of course, a new scramble for minerals in Africa, particularly rare earth minerals, which are found mainly in the DRC, and other African countries have not even begun to scratch the surface in terms of the potential. I spoke to some of the people in the Gulf who were saying this is our petrol moment. In the 1930s, the Gulf discovered oil and gas, and they became who they became. And this is our time as Africans. Now, the most important thing is getting organized and making sure that we beneficiate from our minerals. The biggest challenge, of course, is that we've been selling raw materials and buying them back as finished products. And hopefully, this time around, we are not going to fall into that trap, but we are likely going to try and extract, beneficiate, sell at a much more higher profit.
And just because I mean we have read that this is a crowded space. What do you think this causes in geopolitical terms? Because the Americans are there. You see what they have just done with DRC. The Chinese are deep there. You see what is happening in the Sahel. There is a lot of mineral resource nationalism there. So, what does this do, or rather, what risk does this pose for both Africa and then a potential clash with the other people who are seeking this rare earth?
Well, one will have hoped, of course, that we have learned from our past mistakes. Obviously, we're going to have those people coming in, especially the stakeholders, further dividing and ruling us and taking and stealing our minerals without paying a proper price. So hopefully we've learned from our mistakes. And this time around, I think we should be careful in terms, particularly beneficiation. There must be conditions that is not just going to be extraction. There has to be investment in terms of converting all of these materials into finished goods. So what we have to be selling is we have to be selling finished goods. That's the first point. The other point, of course, one hopes that the African Union is going to play a much more important role in ensuring that there is a governance structure and some sort of unity in policy on how we go about doing it. I mean, we are still by and large very fragmented as Africans. These people are coming in and they thrive on our division. And it's a crowded space, as you correctly put it. The Chinese are here, Russians are here, the Wagner Group is here, the Gulf, particularly the Emiratis and the Qataris, are coming in. The Americans have already signed the deal. Chinese, of course, have been around for a very long time. And all of them, of course, have got individual arrangements with various African countries. There is no pan-Africanist arrangement. And one would have hoped that AU was going to be playing the role of the EU in terms of bloc negotiations for the benefit of Africans. But AU is not anywhere close to becoming what the EU has become. I mean, we saw what happened in Scotland a couple of days ago with Trump making an agreement with EU countries represented by one particular person. And we don't have that at the moment. We're still negotiating separately. And I think that could also set us back.
Because we haven't. Because we haven't. No. And I think I want to annoy Tambisa right at the beginning that he's engaging in wishful thinking because 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 you see there is no difference between the current political establishment in Africa and the African chiefs who sold uh, our people as slaves, who entered into arrangements, as we used to say, they sold our best people in return for mirrors and trinkets. Now, if you look at some of the deals that our first of all, the biggest problem of our politics is that the players who are in African politics are out of their depth in terms of the challenges that they face intellectually. Now, instead of harnessing the likes of the Tembisas and the institutions that they work for, they see them as rivals for influence and keep them away from the process of negotiation. And I'll take the example of Uganda. We are running around trying to raise money for a refinery, and there's never been an attempt to raise money locally or involve potentially local financiers because that creates a stake for oil refinery. Ethiopia is the one that has come closest to doing that when they raised money from people who are employed to build the dam. Now, if imagine the amount of resources and the energy that goes into different African countries fighting in DR Congo on behalf of foreign interests. Look at what happened in Sudan when different African countries became clients or agents of foreign forces. I mean, you had Chad on one side with the UAE, then you had Egypt working with Saudi Arabia, Uganda was in there somewhere, Kenya was in there somewhere. All of them, instead of coming together and saying, wait, let's secure the Sudanese interests as an African country, we failed. So the thing we need to look at now is and really for you Tembisa, as I think I'd like to put this to you, is from how do we evolve the intellectual resources to devise a strategic vision from which the continent can benefit so that people don't go it their own way, and how can we overcome these petty rivalries at a political and international level that undermine our ability, because the key issue is that you find one country A case in Somalia, you find one country representing Turkish interest, you find another one representing Qatari interest, you find another one representing UAE, and all because we're getting some money to buy arms, we're financing consumption lifestyles of or consumerist lifestyles of political actors. Why are we failing to go beyond that and take on the bigger tasks of beneficiating? I like that word. It is now. I'm going to borrow it, Charles, and make it my own. So tell me, sir, how do we do that and develop the thinking? Yeah.
It's a difficult one, Robert, because our forefathers have been trying to do it for a very long time, and maybe it's because we just have a too big of a continent. I'm not sure, and we still have even tribal leanings and behavior in terms of how we react to business partnerships, economics, etc. But I think we can start. We can start mainly by South Africa is in big trouble at the moment in terms of politics. But one thing that they're doing okay and is the advancement of a black middle class. Um, I think that's very not the rich people. I think the mistake that the African National Congress did was to create rich people and produce rich people, ultra rich people. But now they've learned a lesson. I would like to believe, and that the spread of wealth and creating of a viable black middle class, and that's the first point. I think that's very important. Not rich people, but black middle class. We are suffering from these ultra rich, irresponsible individuals who don't even know how to use their money. Instead, they rub salt to the wound every time, showing off with big cars. Those days are gone. It's archaic. It's just crass. And I think more and more Africans are beginning to realize that is actually not necessarily a good thing to be going around showing off expensive car amidst poverty. So the black middle class, I think it's important. It has to be encouraged. The other thing which I think is very important, and it can't be discussed in public, but we can put it forward here in this platform. We need a deep state. We need to create some sort of a deep state that people are going to be behind dictatorship, but these individuals consisting of priests, chiefs, and thinkers, and military people and business people who are going to be like a think tank for our various nations who will continue driving the agenda of goodness, who don't have interests of showing off with their expensive cars, but who like to see, and this is happening around the world, by the way, whether it's in the UK, France, everywhere, there are permanent occupiers of power behind the scene who are driving the objectives of these countries. And they don't have to be elected, by the way, and they don't have to be announced, but their job is to have think tanks. Their job is to have podcasts, and these think tanks will work towards identifying opportunities because politicians don't have time to think. They don't have time to write.
Te- Tembisa, you are. People would say you are being anti-democratic, eh? And you are laying the stage for Freemasons and people like that to take the stage. But you are right, eh? That why is it then that we never have those structures which have a permanent interest in a certain order? That when politics changes, and you've seen this, even in countries which change leaders every 5 or 10 years, when the new guy is coming, and he will build another a highway on next to the old highway because that is that is where they eat from. And all the projects of the last 10 years of the previous government are discarded. So yes, you make a case that we need to move away from that kind of volatility. But just look in Southern Africa. Is there a place where you see this happening? In Botswana, they talk a lot about benefication. They tried that with the beers. What is your take on whether that model worked, and if there's anything we can learn from it?
Well, this is why this discussion must be taken out of the public platform. It's a discussion that's supposed to be, um, outside the glare of the public. And Africans of like-mindedness need to meet behind the scene and begin to craft a way forward. And the reason why these attempts have been sabotaged over the past is because we speak about them in public, and yet the Europeans don't speak about them in public. But we know that there are powers in Britain that continue to drive a political agenda. Yes, of course, we've got democratic processes that are continuing parallel to those powers, but there are permanent powers that are there, and they're not destructive in any way or form. But we need to start thinking about like-mindedness, people meeting occasionally, and thinking. We think about issues of impacting Africa and how we can go about doing this. But again, it can be an open public platform. In South Africa, we used to have something called the Burger Bond, a
Oh
group of
yeah, the
Afrikaners who
broader. I
used to
remember
sit,
that.
think, and dictate how they're going to go about doing things. In Israel, right now, you've got a very deep fundamentalist Zionist movement that drives politics in that country. In the States, you have the same, Bible Belt thinkers who continue to dictate the agenda for the presidency in that country. So I think Africans need something like that. But again, we mustn't minimize it by having a discussion on this platform, because again, that's how it gets sabotaged.
So first of all, I think you've just thrown a gauntlet at us, especially the two of us you found sitting here, because it means that beyond what we're doing on this podcast, we need to just get together and work out maybe in 2026 a kind of quiet conversation somewhere. You can come to where I am on my coffee farm, and then we can sit there and say what needs to happen. But there are two templates that I see from which Africans can learn. The first one is the example you gave, that the meeting in Scotland. And if we go back to the history of how the EU was formed, it's because two people, a German man and a French man, decided that this business of fighting over iron and killing so many people was not necessary. How do we get together and formulate an equitable mechanism by which iron can be shared, and so we don't have to go to war? So I agree with you that maybe Africans need to accept that they don't need public power in order to get things moving. I don't need to be seen as a big man and accepted as such to get things moving. We all have sufficient networks. But then I go back to Tembisa, one of the most difficult times in Africa for my second template. Nobody in the 60s, 70s, and 80s would have ever imagined that new African countries with very few resources could put up one of the most effective platforms for the resistance of imperialism. That was the anti apartheid movement and the frontline states and how that was constructed. And that, in fact, in the past, we have cooperated and coordinated for our own best survival and actually led to the independence, the climax being the removal of apartheid in South Africa. In more, so yes, we do have a template, and yes, I agree with you that maybe quiet work needs to be done. And actually, you bring me back to a third example. One of the most successful presidents in Africa is a man called Jerry Rawlings. He was quite interesting in his success. In fact, it was the early reformists that managed to recover their country. But the establishment that made Rawlings effective was what you call a deep state. There was a group of former Nkrumahist intellectuals. So there was a man called Kwesi Botwe, there was Obed Asamoah, and then there was another soldier. There were two brothers. They are called the Chikata brothers. And then one was running the revenue authority. The other one was a shadowy security guy. He had a very interesting title, senior presidential advisor. He had no office. Then there was another one called PV Obeng. So those guys formed the core of, they were not even elected. None of them was elected, but they formed the core of what was the intellectual foundation for Rawlings's. So I guess we need to look, Charles, at that model, and maybe we should have a detailed discussion about it. How do we form our own deep state? How do we? But also, I think one of the things we'd have to deal with, Tebisa, is how do we stop the rivalry that undermines that deep state? I mean, I saw it with the ANC in South Africa when one faction allied with Zuma went to war with the faction allied with Thabo Mbeki, and they ripped the party apart. How do we, I don't know, from your experience, how do we avoid those and create a shared consensus around the future of either the countries or at least the continent?
Is that to Charles or me?
No, in fact,
Yeah.
Tembisa, just I want you to answer that with this one, and Robert, you will also have to answer this, because what I'm hearing
Mm.
you people say raises a question of whether we can do these things in a democratic context, or do we necessarily have to accommodate ourselves to some authoritarian model? I think at at its most benign form, some people call it the development or dictatorship. So, just when you speak, is it actually possible to have both that and a kind of a liberal democracy? But yeah, back to you, Tembesa.
Yes, I think so. I think it's possible. I think we can have parallel processes. I mean, democracy must go ahead and all the beautiful things that comes with it. But this one is a permanent occupation of thought, and these are people who are not ambitious to become politicians or presidents, but they understand the leadership, because all of us we frame leadership on politics, but you don't necessarily have to be a politician to be a leader. And amongst the three of us, for example, we have contacts. I've spent time and I lived, still live in Qatar and in Doha, and I know people. Uh, but those people expect to intermingle and interact with similar-minded people in my continent that they can do business. So the responsibility of this platform that I'm suggesting will be multifaceted. Meet. I'm not saying I'm calling for a clandestine movement of any sort, but it's important. It's important for us to have this going on if we really want to see this continent improving, particularly now with these rare earth. And there's going to be a big scramble coming in, and you are likely to have these countries and stakeholders creating conflicts so that they can continue extracting as they're continually doing in the Red Sea, whether it's in Somalia or any other place. The busiest passage of waters in the world, but the people bordering those waters are not benefiting in any way or form, and what they resort to is, criminality. And then you've got the stakeholders who fund this criminality to perpetuate because they thrive in disorder. So I think we need to really think about it. And again, it can't be a public platform. It has to be, carefully selected group. It's happening in South Africa, I think, at the moment.
Uh-huh.
But the carefully selected individuals that will continue working behind the scene for the benefit of their people and the benefit of the continent. And as it stands at the moment, these democracies and presidents that are elected, most of whom are poor and they use these platforms to make themselves rich, it's problematic. So we need to start looking at. We need to. I mean, I know people like Mo Ibrahim and Dangote are trying hard to fund and help, but it's again not a substantial platform or movement that seeks to one encourage and promote the black middle class, but importantly, a group of men, good men, who are going to be there and making sure that our country and the continent continue to thrive. These are people who will have contacts at higher places overseas. These are people who will work towards nurturing relationships, and we can divide ourselves, into north, east, south, and west. And all of us at any given point, we go and meet with powers that be. For example, none of us have got a direct line to Vladimir Putin. When we see that the Wagner Group is creating problems, we start using political platforms to try and call them to order and read the riot act. But we need to have a direct contact with Vladimir Putin and impress on him why it's important for Africa to thrive without using these politicians. So that's what I'm calling for, I think. But again, it's not something that we have to discuss in public. It's something that we need to somehow meet and begin. I'm also a Muslim, and I know how Muslims operate. For example, whether it's in South Africa, East
Oh,
Africa,
yes.
or in the Gulf, there is a deep state within the Muslim community of which I'm part of. You know, people meet in a mosque, in a masjid, and they discuss issues of national interest, and they decide on how to go about moving forward because they've got interests for their people. So if you want to look at the deep state, actually outside the Jewish communities, which I don't think are as
Mm.
powerful as the Muslim community, I think the Muslim community deep state is extremely entrenched. Uh,
Oh,
it's all over the
yes.
world. In East Africa, for example, if you look how the Muslims are organized and operate, they smile with all of us, right? I'm also part of it. But guess what? There's these parallels that are thriving socially, culturally, economically. How is it happening? It's happening because they've got a mosque. They go there and they get a ruling on how to do certain things, how to behave, how to do this, and what to eat and what not to eat, and who to buy from and who not to buy from. And that creates a
Hmm.
platform that is working. So this is a very overt deep state within the Muslim communities, and I can say so because I'm part of it. It's an overt deep state, but it is functioning and it thrives. Africans need to start thinking along those lines, and if we don't, and I'm not saying let us, but I mean, this deep state I'm talking about, by the way, it can be multicultural, multiracial, as long as people align and they do believe love the continent as we all do, they're going to be part of it. It's not going to be a racial arrangement, but it's going to be of people who of similar interests.
Just there is the there is something you said that about this being our oil moment, but it's where do you see it panning out well? Because what you and Bob have said, it's not very reassuring.
I couldn't get the question,
No,
Charles.
this rare earth has offers us it. You called it our oil moment. That is um, you know the Gulf had 80, 90 years ago, but they this fear that it is turning into a curse and it's a moment that might be missed. Is that misplaced?
Yeah, I think it comes at a very challenging moment. These opportunities and this opportunity in particular, um, and we see how it has impacted our politics in South Africa with the greatest man who has the greatest interest in this is Elon Musk, who happens to be a South African. And he understands this importance and is imposing himself on the political infrastructure of South Africa to change and alter so that it can be accommodated as it continues or wishes to extract. Now, the benefit that we've had in South Africa is that we've got systems in place. And you want to come in and start a business, you must follow proper procedures. And because of that, he feels that he can be destructive because he wants to override the systems that we've put in place. And it's not only him, by the way. You also have nations such as China. The reason why China is thriving in most African countries is because they know that they come in, they're businessmen, and businessmen are about maximization of profits. And in the absence of policies, in the absence of laws and regulations, they will do as they wish until, of course, Africans wake up to put systems in place that will make sure that these exploitations are curtailed. In South Africa, of course, they can't do that because we've got laws and regulations, but most African countries don't have. Now, I see the same trapping if we don't get organized or if we don't get our act in order. You're going to have all of these stakeholders. There's already started, by the way, in the DRC. I mean, DRC is free for all, unfortunately. The extraction of these rare earths and other minerals are just taking place. People are opening up their own railway lines and they've got their own airplane runways. It's all systems go. People come in with their own aeroplanes and they steal and plunder as they wish. Right now, we've got the Lopido corridor, which the Americans are sponsoring, that's going to go from all the way from Botswana, Zambia, DRC to Angola. The reason why South Africa is sidelined is because South Africa, again, we've got laws and order, and we've got people who are politically loud and aware of what's going on. So what they are now doing, the Americans are shifting all the infrastructure, including political infrastructure, diplomatic infrastructure. Everything is going to Rwanda, because Rwanda is going to be the next. By the way, it's even quicker and closer
Yeah.
too. It's in the Atlantic. So Rwanda is likely to become one of the most critical and important ports that will be now extracting these new rare earths from all of these countries I've just mentioned into the United States, and we might not have much control, because I think the reason why Joe Biden insisted in his last days to go and visit Angola, is because he wanted to make sure that he signed a deal, and he did sign the deal, and now we're seeing Trump continuing with it. Hence my suggestion earlier
Mm.
on of the deep state. Trump took over from Biden, but in all appearances, it seems as if they disagree on everything, but they don't disagree on everything. There's
No,
one
no. In
particular
fact,
mission.
that is probably the only one they all agree on,
Oh yeah,
and
and they know
maybe
what
trusting,
Biden did it.
the rise of China. But you've touched on a point which I want us to go to next. About what a concerted African effort, what difference it would make. One of the things that has has happened in the few days is South Africa has spoken and seems to be acting uh, quite strongly within its means to add Nigeria to the G20. Now, it is this is I mean, if you need to go back perhaps to the beginning of the 2000s, what was happening when we had people like Obasanjo, who was president in Nigeria, and Thabo Mbeki, the process that led to the reform of the OAU and the creation of the African Union. This is probably the first time that South Africa has done something like this to back Nigeria. What is happening? Is this a wind that will blow, or are we seeing the beginning of kind of a partnership? Maybe very soon. I don't know. You have South Africa, you have Nigeria. Maybe you bring in Angola, like you have said. Maybe Egypt. Are we entering a new age of those kind of the alliances that we saw at the beginning of the 2000s?
I think at the government level, South Africa has always tried to improve relations between itself and Nigeria. The best times, of course, as you correctly put it, was during the days of President Obasanjo and Thabo Mbeki, where there was a clear intention of working together. And we're seeing that now once again resuscitated. And the reason why it's resuscitated is because Africans realize that they're on their own. Trump has pushed Africans into a new situation which requires alliances and strong political arm twisting when it comes to negotiations. And you can't ignore Nigeria. Nigeria is an extremely important country in this continent, and South Africa realizes that. And now what they're doing is wherever they go, they lobby for Nigeria to be part and parcel of whatever it is that they intend doing. One, number two is, of course, friends are becoming fewer for South Africa, and it's rare, especially when it comes to matters of Western Sahara and Morocco. Morocco is making a lot of friends very fast, and South Africa, because of the Western Sahara situation, is losing more friends in Africa very fast. So countries such as Nigeria therefore become very important for South Africa, because it's going to be, if it doesn't really move fast in terms of charm offensive politically, is likely to be isolated. And we see what's happening at the moment. If you look at all the criticisms and Trump's targets in Africa has not been necessarily Nigeria, it's been South Africa.
Yeah.
And, which means that South Africa can be replaced. And by the way, Nigeria is on the West Coast. arguably closer to closer to the
Okay,
United
yeah.
States than anything else, and we have got the diaspora in the United States. Nigeria diaspora is very, very influential and huge in the United States. Other people argue that they're beginning to even influence politics in that country, and Trump understands that. So, because of that, I think South Africa is also, you know, waking up to reality that you want to really survive and you want to play in this game consisting of big boys. You have to start courting powerful African countries, and whenever you go negotiate, you use them or you bring them with you. South Africa has been a blue-eyed boy for a very long time. The fact that it's been the only one in the G20 before AU actually was accepted as a permanent member, there was an element of arrogance, one will argue. And now, of course, that light, the lamplight is dimming. And when the lamplight dims, you start looking for friends. And that, I think that's what they're doing. And I think it's going to work with Nigeria. But after that, I think they'll have to do the people to people's lobbying, because that in itself was also deteriorated. I mean, South Africans and the
Yeah,
Nigerians are
yeah.
in this very toxic competition, which is so unnecessary, particularly given that South Africa's got a lot of companies in Nigeria. But the level of xenophobia in this country against the Nigerians is way unacceptable, and the government is dragging its feet in terms of addressing it. Civil society is doing a lot in terms of addressing it. But the reason why there's this amplification, notwithstanding, of course, that there are a lot of other xenophobic attacks or challenges that Nigeria faces, not only in South Africa, but in all in other countries in Africa. But South Africa is the one that has amplified this problem.
So, Bob, we're looking at this. Okay, we have looked at what happens with outsiders, but and now we're kind of looking inside, and looking at South Africa's support for Nigeria to join the G20. What else are you seeing? Are there? Do you see some movements? Do you see some alliances in Africa which you think promise to blossom into um, kind of strong forces? I mean, the kind of thing we see with the Sahel states, these military juntas who have gone and formed their own little radical club. But if you move away from that type and you look at this kind of model that we're seeing from South Africa, Nigeria.
And 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 I think it goes back to where we started. We have an unprincipled and unhealthy rivalry amongst African political leaders for predominance. And I think there are even old historical problems that interfere with the ability of these countries to step outside of themselves. Um, the good example is one of the most promising alliances was the East African Community, and I feel that it has expanded too rapidly before addressing some of the primary suspicions that arise between the different leaders that were driving this agenda. And so the thing that we need to look to is what drives the alliances. If you look at the alliance that existed between Nyerere and Kaunda and Samora Machel and later on Robert Mugabe, there was an ideological commonality about independence and nationalism that drove them. I feel that what's missing on the African continent is an ideological consensus on what needs to be done and how to go forward. Now, this is where I said that I fault the three of us seated here, because one of the things that we have not done, unlike our predecessors like the Wole Soyinkas, the Ali Mazruis, the Peter Abrahams, the intellectual class that provided the vision or articulated what the aspiration should be, even though they were not in public office, they were able to give voice to what Pan Africanism means. Uh, the question today we need to grapple with is what does or what should Pan Africanism mean? For some of the leaders on the continent, it means blind and unquestioning loyalty to their rule, simply because they happen to espouse those ideas. Whether they behave that way or not is a different matter. So I think there is need for a redefinition of, in the world today as it is, what should Pan-Africanism be? And that falls on the intellectual class, the people like me and you who have been gifted with the opportunity to be exposed, to think deeply, to be able, and who have the luxury of sitting back. We're not in public office. We don't have to do deals. We have the time to think. So we need that to be defined to drive the agenda for people to come together. We are too driven by technical aspects, how to collaborate on whether to put a road or not to put a road. But and I'll say this coming from Tembisa, the thing that I find disappointing about South Africa is that South Africa missed the opportunity to provide leadership for this continent in a very concrete way. A lot of South Africans saw themselves, they didn't see themselves as Africans, they saw themselves as Europeans because of the level of development at which their country was. And they saw the rest of us on the continent as a terrible inconvenience that must be kept out. And which is why some of the most stringent visa controls by South Africa are against other African countries. And the immigration that comes, they don't see the immigration of Africans into their country as a blessing. Because if you look at how South Africa has benefited from communities, whether it's Somalis, Ethiopians, Nigerians, Ugandan doctors and teachers who have made a big difference, Kenyan business people, Nigerian business people, Ghanaian professionals, Zimbabwean accountants. They've built South Africa in ways in which South Africa doesn't acknowledge. And yet, when Trump shakes them a little bit about tariffs, they start, getting bound up in a twist. Oh, we're dead. What? But nobody thinks, what if we harnessed these resources of the continent? What if South Africa drove the agenda of the African Free Trade, the AFCTA? How would they benefit? So, and then, Nigeria has weakened itself with the quality. It's become so municipal, and their arguments are so local that they've completely also forgotten about their own position on the continent. uh, Tanzania has become so insular. Sudan's been torn by a civil war. Congo just has no people to do this thing. So for me, I feel that we now need to look elsewhere. And where can we look? I think one of the places we can look is the African business community, because it is they're the ones who are able to see the Pan African nature. I think if we're looking at what you talked about, the deep state, so people like Strive Masiyiwa, who has huge investments in technology on the continent, people like Patrice Motsepe, who is driving football, uh, people like more Ibrahim. He needs to be less of, how shall I put it, less of a. I think there's a bit of self. Yeah, maybe it's his age, but so and step out. We need that to happen in order to evolve a thinking and a basis on which around which people unite. So, for instance, common causes. How do we deal with infrastructure that brings Africans together? Why is it possible for young activists on a political scale to collaborate across the continent, and the African leaders only collaborate in oppressing them, and on methods of oppressing them? You see but when it comes, so they collaborate for their political survival, but they don't collaborate for advancement. So these are the things that we need. We need places where we can go to have conversations of this nature. And as you said, Tembisa, earlier on, and I really like the idea to say, okay, yes, we may not be, you may not like Nguema Mbasogo and of Equatorial Guinea. He may actually be a very nasty character, but someone has to talk to him. Somebody has to reach out to him and say, look, okay, you are like this, but can we do the following things together? Can you see the commonality of us Africans? I think the theme for me from today, Charles, is that how do we derive and evolve a commonality, even if it's minimum, whether it's around business, whether it's around technology, whether it's around athletics, whether it's around culture. One of the greatest collaborations, by the way, Tembisa, was the collaboration between two of the greatest African musicians, Huma Sekela and Fela Anikulapo Kuti in Nigeria. Now, those things, yes, yeah,
You want the political equivalent. No, but Robert and Tembisa, they if you see the last kind of like 1 2 years, there seems to be uh, a kind of younger leaders. Probably not all of them are a very
Senegal,
parochial. I mean, we saw in
Senegal,
Botswana, we've seen even this guy in Wema in Gabon. He took off his uniform. He's fairly young. The coups these days no longer produce 60-year-old generals to lead. They produce leaders in their 30s, and you saw what is happening in Senegal. They have a fair young leadership in Ivory Coast. Of course, Ouattara at 83 is thrown his hat in the ring, and Bia is continuing at 92. So I mean, there are those, but if you look at those movements, someone could actually argue that look, in terms of the leadership, there is something interesting happening. You have younger leaders; they may not necessarily all be progressive, so if someone asks you to give them some signs of hope, what would you say?
Well, my only challenge is that they're starting from scratch. And if you look at leadership in other countries, is hereditary. Now, this new leadership, which is exciting, I must say, they're starting from scratch. They have to start and this is why there's a need for us to have a deep state. Because imagine if you have this leadership coming in, then they know who the fathers behind the scene are. They'll go there and they'll be taken by the hand and be introduced in all the powers that be around the world. But right now, these are revolutionaries who are articulating the voices of the young. But I can tell you now, they've got no context whatsoever. They'll have to start from scratch. There's no experience. And we're still going to go back to square one. With the Prime Torre, for example, a popular leader in Africa at the moment, I think is going to struggle. And this hype that we all see, we pray for him that he succeeds. But this hype that you see at the moment is likely to win in a very, very short space of time. And he'll soon realize that politics require established alliances and contacts and people who are fit for purpose, and you want to continue with that. So that's the only challenge. And maybe there are still some possible interventions somehow where we can support these young people and these young leaders if they do listen. But in the absence of that established deep state, unfortunately, I don't see this become sustainable in the long run. You're going to have all of these revolutionaries and revolutions taking place, but we'll have to go back to square one in terms of how they take the people forward. Because the Europeans are established. They've got an established structure in terms of leadership and behind the scene, and they've got kingdoms and monarchies and all of those kind of things are all linked, and they love and mingle with each other on a daily basis. We always have to start from scratch because I don't know what my father did or what he left for me. So it's my news. I'm always Africans are always new money, novo rich,
no.
because we don't
Tembisa,
inherit
you are
anything.
wrong. We're always
So
inheriting
this is again,
poverty.
if you think about it, it's a political novo
Oh,
rich. We inherit poverty, we make it, and our kids messed up the money, and then we start afresh again, third, fourth generation. So there's no sustainability in our successes, whether it's economic or politically. And perhaps this could be the first, something that we can start looking at. Clearly, these young leaders have got people that we know, And if you come up with something sellable, something more attractive, and it's got some incentives, we present it to them to say, this is who we are, this is what we want to do, and this is how we're going to help you. Because if we don't, guess what? Wagner Group will come, the Chinese will come, the French will come. By the way, if they're not already there, young men has got ambitions, it's got young kids who like,
Yeah.
the biggest, the first, by the way,
No,
downfall of all of
wives,
us are our
Charles.
children and wives, right? And
Or
so
mistresses, for that matter, for
I
some
lived
of them.
in Doha with or husbands for those who are working. But
Yes.
I lived. I know Ferral will be upset if she sees me saying that, but I lived in Doha with the Taliban
Really?
for a very long time. They were in St. Regis when they were still negotiating from 2014. And the first thing I said was, these guys are not going back to Kandahar and in Kabul because their kids were eating ice cream every day and everybody else was going for shopping and life was nice. And it happened. It polarized the entire Taliban movement because when the negotiation started, it was their kids who said, "No, Daddy, I'm not going back to Kabul. I'm happy in Doha at St. Regis Hotel
Wow.
for the past 5 years. Why must I go back to Kabul?" So now these are these are the trappings of young leadership and young people who are leading. It's not about their revolutionarism and principle politics. It's about those people that surround them and that they love. And they are not committed and they're not supposed to be politicians or revolutionaries. They want to have a good normal life. And how do you tell your kids that you can't have ice cream anymore? Because I'm gonna go back to live with you in Kabul. Now, these are the things that we need to be. We need to help these young
Charles.
revolutionaries.
The only thing I can say is that the future, the
Well,
mistakes we made in the 70s and 80s was to keep our eyes focused only on the establishment and the leadership. And one of the things we missed, especially in South Africa, was how the student movement emerged as a potent political force. That if actually, because it's they who eventually brought down apartheid. I think we now need to look again to the younger demographic on the African continent. Forget the populist leaders that are coming in. So, for instance, let's look, how are young people organizing politically on the continent? One of the things you see a lot is collaboration between political groups, and technology is making that very easy. Whenever a cause comes up in one country, you see an immediate solidarity that is expressed, and there is a groundswell of support. I think one of the things that's going to facilitate a shared African identity to start with is the technology that makes this possible. Now, the second thing is strange, but it comes from two guys in America. I think that Trump, by doing what he has done, by cutting us loose, is forcing us to think for ourselves, because we had outsourced the thinking and intellectual processes to Washington and the West. Now these guys are saying, look, guys, we don't have anything to do with you. Stay on your side. So we're going to be forced to think, and that's going to force us to evolve our own identity. And then the second one, Tembisa, this might make you laugh, is a man, is a former African called Elon Musk. So you see, the one thing that you see what Elon Musk has cleverly done with his Starlink is he might make it impossible for African leaders to switch off the internet just like that. I think that the control of yes, and that is going to be very critical in that it will probably actually fail the African people who are obsessed with control and managing this and that to do. So now the question is, how do we harness or prepare people to take
Yeah.
advantage of that new opportunity? And this is where we go back to your earlier suggestion that maybe people like us need to evolve into a deep state and start to work into deepening this state even further. And this is where I say to you, Tembisa, first of all, we think you need to become a bad native and be here more often with us. Yeah. And I think between myself and Charles, we're
more
going to
often,
start a
yes.
conversation about a project around that quiet consultation that you were talking about. I think, Charles, me and you need to learn a bit more from Tembis about that and how that can be driven. Myself and Charles have been involved in it and with it on and off informally, but I think there needs to be a disciplined approach to it. So that's what I would say for now, Charles. And prepare to hit the road now.
Yeah. It's really, really, really been wonderful to have you, Tembisa. You have
Yes.
got yourself in trouble, huh? No good deed goes unpunished, as they say. So you must come back. And I think like the note which I sent to you, usually one of the things we do is we have parting shots, and it can be something which inspired you, something crazy, something that broke your heart. So we'll ask you to give us your
So
parting
so
shot.
so what's yours?
Sure, by all means.
Yeah. So what is your parting shot? What
Oh,
has
your parting shot.
delighted
Oh,
or broken your heart in the last few days?
well, my parting shot. First of all, thank you very much for this very important discussion. I think there's a lot of work to be done before we die. at least, uh, at least that's a deposit for the hereafter. At least we have an excuse to negotiate with God when we get there to say we did something behind. But importantly, I think the manner in which we think, the first biggest achievement is the ability to destroy this shock absorb of excitement with money. And of course, it's easy for us to speak because we're fairly comfortable. But you have to destroy that. And I think that's why I'm calling for this African middle class, because the middle class understands other things and appreciate other things instead of just accumulation and being ultra rich, which is something that's dominating our communities and societies, judging by what I see on the social media. We need to encourage that middle class, but introducing a middle class in Africa will take really deeper thoughts and interventions and manipulations and you know discussions at a much more broader level. And I think that's very urgent. It has to start as soon as possible because the manner in which we're heading at the moment.
You know, there's it's election season in Uganda, and there's
Bob?
been these primaries going on. Political parties are selecting candidates. So, in a friend of mine who lives in the US was really perturbed. So he sent me a video or three videos of violence in one of the remote places in Uganda where people were drawing guns and shooting at each other, beating each other. Bodyguards were at each other's necks. The bodyguards of one candidate are fighting the bodyguards of another candidate. And it just, then at some point, it descended into a gunfight, and you could see civilians and people taking cover. Now, the guy's question, Charles, is what really, really struck me. He didn't ask why all of this was going on. No, that's not the question he asked. He said, how can people be so passionate about public service that they're willing to kill each other and draw guns? He said, how did we? Exactly.
Well, to which the answer is that they are not passionate about the
Over to
public
you, Charles.
service. They are, as Tembisa said, they are looking for ice cream. Yeah. So so first, before I have mine, can I remind you, please, if you like this program, if you've been following, please hit, the bell on YouTube so that you get notification when a new one is posted, and follow us. And it makes it possible for us to continue, and also follow us on our social media platforms and on Spotify and other places. So mine is it has to be Trump, huh? Because he's done something which I didn't actually think was possible. He is actually the first American leader who has made African presidents look very good. Because
Mm,
by comparison to most of them, he's really worse. He did
mm.
he did two things between June 21st and now. Three times Trump has, with a straight face, claimed that American money was used to build the God dam in Ethiopia.
Ah,
This is a guy who goes looking for people's
but
successes and claims them, and everyone is so puzzled. They said, "What the hell?" But that isn't the worst.
mm,
I think the worst was at the press conference in Scotland a few days ago. He's of course giving himself credit for solving the world's problems, and then he said that
the
uh,
genocide.
in Rwanda 7 million people were killed. He's talking about the 1994
Mm.
genocide against the Tutsi. He said 7 million people were killed, which is wrong. It was just 1 million. And then he said, "I put a stop to that." Huh? He
Do you
ended
remember
that one.
him?
But
Do you remember? Do you remember?
but in 1994, Trump was he was fighting bankruptcy, and he was 22 years away from becoming president. And I said, man, this guy is really making many of our guys look
And now he was surprised that the,
yeah.
the president of Liberia could speak good English.
It's incredible. So yeah,
Yeah, that was bad, man.
I mean, I just and there is this joke. I think it's an AI generated thing where he was complaining.
No, but seriously, Tembisa, we think Lamola is a Sangoma because as soon as they walked out of the White House, the Musk and Trump started fighting, and it's been south since then.
Yeah, they left some juju there somewhere.
Yeah, they left Juju. So Bob, have a nice ride back to Kampala. And Mbisa, it's been wonderful to have you and look forward to having you again. So see you next week.